This is a single structure, 300 meters long, 200 wide, smaller than most shopping malls. At its peak, it held an estimated 33,000 people. That works out to roughly 1.9 million people per square kilometer. By most estimates, the highest population density any place on Earth has ever recorded, before or since. Inside, sunlight barely reached the ground. Pipes, wires, and makeshift bridges connected buildings so tightly that residents could cross the entire structure without ever stepping outside. And here's the strange part. This wasn't a slum that spiraled out of control. It was a legal loophole, a single line in a 19th century treaty that, over 90 years, grew an entire ungoverned city inside it. This is the story of Kowloon Walled City, the place two governments spent a century agreeing they didn't want to run. They buried it, were digging it back up. Long before it was a vertical maze of concrete, Kowloon Walled City was exactly what its name says, a walled city. In 1847, the Qing dynasty built a small fortified outpost here. A garrison with stone walls, a yamen for local officials, watchtowers, and a handful of cannons, meant to keep an eye on the increasingly troublesome British colony taking shape next door in Hong Kong. That British colony kept growing. In 1898, Britain and China signed an agreement, the Second Convention of Peking, leasing a large stretch of land north of Hong Kong Island, called the New Territories, to Britain for 99 years. It's the same lease that, a century later, would set the clock on Hong Kong's eventual handover back to China. But there was a catch. Tucked into the treaty's language, the walled fort was specifically carved out as an exception. China would keep the right to station officials there, even though the British now controlled everything around it. That arrangement lasted about a year. In 1899, the British, worried the enclave could become a foothold for Chinese resistance to their new colony, sent troops in and expelled the Chinese officials. And then something unusual happened. Almost nothing. Britain had removed the Chinese administration, but never formally folded the walled city into its own colonial governance either. China, for its part, never gave up its technical claim to the site. For the next several decades, both governments effectively agreed, without ever quite saying so, to leave it alone. Not fully British, not fully Chinese. Administratively, it was almost nowhere. During the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong in World War II, occupying forces tore down the old stone walls entirely, using the rubble to help extend the runway at nearby Kai Tak Airport. The wall was gone, but the legal ambiguity that had built up around the site for half a century didn't disappear with it. If anything, it left the land even more of a blank slate, with no physical barrier and no functioning authority, right as Hong Kong was about to face a wave of people who badly needed somewhere to live. After World War II, and especially after the communist victory in mainland China in 1949, Hong Kong absorbed an enormous wave of refugees. Housing couldn't come close to keeping pace, and squatters looking for a place to build discovered that the old walled fort site had something incredibly rare in Hong Kong. No landlord, no building codes, and, because neither government wanted to touch it, no one enforcing zoning of any kind. By the early 1950s, people were building. First simple huts, then, as more arrived, structures climbing upward, 3 stories, then 5, then more, packed edge to edge, because there was no regulation stopping anyone from building right up against their neighbour's wall, or straight on top of an existing structure's roof. In this early, chaotic period, organised crime moved in fast. Triad groups, most notably the Sun Yee-on, effectively ran much of the walled city through the 1950s and 60s. Opium dens, brothels, unlicensed gambling parlours, all operating in a pocket of the city that Hong Kong police were reluctant to enter. Large-scale police raids happened only rarely, and even then had limited lasting effect. For outsiders, the walled city's reputation as a lawless no-go zone was built in this era, and it stuck for decades. But the building never stopped. Through the 1960s and into the 70s and 80s, more than 300 individual buildings, most without a single professional architect or engineer involved, fused together into what was structurally one continuous mass. Some blocks reached 12, 13, 14 stories, limited mainly by a nearby informal ceiling, tied to flight paths into Kai Tak Airport, whose approach passed startlingly close overhead. Because ground-level streets had long since narrowed into unlit, pipe-choked tunnels barely wide enough for one person, residents built an entire secondary layer of life on the rooftops. Walkways, laundry lines, even a rooftop school playground for children, stitched together across dozens of buildings. For many residents, especially kids, the roof was the only place they reliably saw open sky. At street level, the density created something almost architectural in its strangeness. Narrow air shafts, some barely wide enough to stretch your arms across, were the only source of natural light for apartments deep inside the structure. Residents nicknamed the whole place the City of Darkness. In the 1970s, the crime lord era was fading. Increased policing pressure and internal community organizing pushed the triads' overt control back. What replaced it wasn't order exactly, but something more interesting. An entire self-organized informal economy built specifically around the one thing the walled city still offered that nowhere else in Hong Kong could: freedom from licensing. By the 1980s, the walled city had become known across Hong Kong for something almost mundane: cheap, unlicensed dentists and doctors. Practitioners who'd trained in mainland China but couldn't get a license to practice in British Hong Kong set up clinics here instead, where no licensing authority operated. At one point, the walled city reportedly held somewhere around 100 unlicensed dental and medical practices, enough that outside residents would specifically travel in just for cheap dental work, then leave again. Food production worked the same way. Small unlicensed factories inside the walled city produced a significant share of Hong Kong's fish balls and noodles at various points. Again, because operating without health inspections and licensing fees let them undercut prices everywhere else in the city. For the tens of thousands who actually lived here though, daily life was less about crime or novelty and more about ordinary survival packed into an extraordinary space. Apartments were frequently under 25 square meters, sometimes far smaller, often home to entire families. Postal workers reportedly memorized specific routes through the maze just to make deliveries, since their streets had no reliable naming system and the interior geometry could genuinely disorient outsiders. And yet, repeatedly, in interviews given by former residents after the demolition, a common theme emerges that pushes back against the lawless hellhole reputation. Strong community bonds. Neighbours who'd lived stacked on top of each other for decades knew each other by name, looked after each other's children, organised informal associations to manage water access, garbage, and small disputes, in the near total absence of any formal municipal government. Outside Hong Kong, and especially in Western media, the walled city's reputation leaned hard into the sensational, an ungovernable den of vice, filth, and crime. Inside, for many who actually lived there, it was simply home, dense, imperfect, sometimes genuinely dangerous, but also a functioning, self-sufficient community that the outside world had mostly abandoned to govern itself. By the mid-1980s, both the British Hong Kong government and China had reasons to want the walled city gone. Hong Kong's eventual 1997 handover to China was already being negotiated, and the walled city's decades-old jurisdictional ambiguity was an awkward loose end neither side particularly wanted, hanging over the transition. In January 1987, the two governments jointly announced the walled city would be demolished. The announcement didn't go smoothly. Many long-time residents resisted, both out of attachment to homes some had lived in for generations, and over disputes about compensation, since ownership records inside a structure that had grown almost entirely outside any legal system were, unsurprisingly, a tangled mess. Negotiations over payouts and relocation stretched on for years. Demolition finally began in 1993 and finished in 1994. What had taken more than 4 decades to grow, one unregulated addition at a time, came down in about a year. In its place, the government built Kowloon Walled City Park, A landscaped garden in a Qing dynasty style, deliberately echoing the site's original identity as a walled fort. A few original relics were preserved, sections of the old fort's foundation, a handful of cannons, a rescued yamen building, where 33,000 people once lived stacked on top of each other in darkness. There's now a quiet public garden with koi ponds and pavilions. But the walled city didn't just disappear from memory. Its silhouette, that impossibly dense, tangled megastructure, became a visual shorthand that architects, urban planners, and filmmakers have returned to again and again. It's cited as a direct influence on the cyberpunk aesthetic of films like Ghost in the Shell, and it's been recreated in whole or in part in video games and art installations fascinated by what a city looks like when literally no one is in charge of designing it, which might be the strangest legacy of all. A place both governments spent a century trying not to deal with, became, after it was gone, one of the most studied urban spaces of the 20th century. Kowloon Walled City existed for less than 100 years, and it took less than one to erase almost completely. But for the tens of thousands who called it home, it wasn't a curiosity or a case study. It was simply where they lived, built by nobody in particular, for exactly as long as two governments could avoid deciding what to do with it. So here's the question. Could a place like this exist today? Or has the world gotten too regulated, too surveilled, too connected for a true legal blank spot like this to ever open up again? Let me know what you think in the comments. Next Chronicle's already buried and waiting. Subscribe so you don't miss it.